Just going to give a couple of minutes just for people to start joining us. I see everybody's starting to make their way in. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to get started. I want to say thank you all for joining us tonight for Newly Diagnosed Getting Started. I'm Nicole Jarvis. I am Assistant Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I will be the presenter for this evening's 60-minute webinar. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping items related to accreditation. Today's webinar is accredited for CEs by ANCC, the California Board of Registered Nursing, the New York State Education Department State Board for Social Work, NASW, and the Society for Human Resource Management. If you plan on receiving continuing education credit for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must call in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and post-test, as well as receive a passing grade on the post-test. Following today's session, we actually are going to try something new tonight and put the link to the evaluation and post-test in the chat box during the Q&A session. But you will also receive a follow-up email tomorrow by 5 p.m. And certificates will be emailed within 4 to 6 weeks if you qualify for CEs. Also, please note that the planners and presenters for this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and no commercial support was provided for this program. So for those of you who are new to Cancer and Careers, we are a national nonprofit and the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their working environment. We do so via our comprehensive website, our free publications that are available in English and Spanish, and career coaching. We also offer educational seminars for employees with cancer and their colleagues and healthcare providers. Also, currently in the process of developing resources that are directly addressing the employment-related challenges being faced by cancer survivors during the COVID-19 pandemic. By visiting our website, you can access all of our programs and publications and register for any events that are upcoming. So the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series is sponsored in part by a generous grant from Genentech, and we're also very grateful for the tremendous contributions provided by HSN and QVC. Additionally, Cancer and Careers year-round sponsors support all of CAC's core programs, including this one, and also allows us to provide all of our programs and services free of charge. So today's presentation is called Newly Diagnosed Getting Started. I'm guessing that many, if not all of you on this call, chose to be here because you consider yourself to be newly diagnosed or are working with patients who are newly diagnosed. But we do know that that phrase can mean different things to different people. So some of you may have been diagnosed just a few days ago, so are perhaps trying to wrap your head around everything. Some of you may have already started treatment and made some of those decisions and choices about how to move forward in regards to your job. Some may be facing a recurrence and looking for new approaches to balancing work and treatment this time around. Or maybe you're in yet a different place than the ones I've mentioned. But regardless of where exactly you are in your journey, we do hope that you'll be able to leave here this evening with some new helpful information that's relevant to you and can really help you determine the path forward that's going to work best for you. I do also just want to acknowledge, while there is guidance throughout this presentation for people who are either working or looking for work, we really leaned into the part of the conversation that focuses on those that are trying to balance an existing job with a diagnosis. So for any of you that are on this call who are actively looking for work, I encourage you to also check out our many job search specific programs and resources, just as an accompaniment to the information that's presented today, so that you can feel even more prepared for that process. So before we jump into exploring the various work concerns that often present themselves early on in a cancer journey, as well as the potential approaches to managing them, I would really like to start by talking about some of the common misconceptions about cancer and work, which we often hear about people encountering and can feel particularly daunting. Misconceptions such as people diagnosed with a serious or chronic medical condition don't want to work. People diagnosed with a serious or chronic medical condition can't work. People balancing work and a medical condition will not be as productive. And unfortunately, the list goes on. What's important to remember when thinking about work is that it's often about a lot more than a paycheck and benefits, which of course are important, but there is that identity piece to it that shouldn't be overlooked. Many people take pride in their jobs and their employment and get satisfaction from working regardless of the industry or role, because understandably, work is a big part of who they are. So this idea that cancer is going to take away the ability or the desire to work is often false. We list these here to really highlight the range of misconceptions around a cancer diagnosis as it relates to work. And we'll be discussing strategies and tools that will really help you to understand how to approach your situation in order to make informed decisions about whether, if, or how to work during all or part of treatment. So this brings us to the heart of this work and cancer conversation, and that's of the diagnosis and the work dilemma. For many people, the question of how work factors in or whether it factors in at all becomes really, really important. And it can be quite challenging to look at the big picture when you're also focused on addressing a major health crisis, because all of the unknowns can feel, understandably, really overwhelming. It's important in these moments to acknowledge the reality of what's going on, and then from there, start to isolate and answer some specific questions that will help to illuminate that best path forward that we talked about. So what are the questions to consider asking yourself in order to make the best decisions about balancing work and cancer? A good place to start is by spending some time thinking about what your wants are versus just what your needs are. They tend to vary from person to person. And when people start to list out their wants and needs, they do sometimes find that they aren't in alignment with one another, and that's totally okay. The idea here is to really take a step back and start evaluating the individual parts within the bigger picture so that you can figure out what's true for you. So for example, what are your financial and your insurance needs? For some people, those are going to be driving decisions about whether or not to work during treatment, but for others, that's not the case. So maybe also asking yourself, how is your identity connected to your job? Maybe you love what you do and want to make sure that you're able to continue doing it because it's going to help you cope during treatment. Again, this isn't going to be the case for everyone, but the point is to have a sense of how that comes into play for you. And of course, no person is only their job and their diagnosis. So what might you want to consider in terms of your personal life? Do you have an obligation to family or loved ones that needs to be prioritized? What do you think you might need in terms of self-care, which we all know is so important? You may also find that once you start asking yourself these questions, more and more questions start to crop up that maybe you don't know how to answer by yourself. And again, that's okay too. We're going to take some more time to talk about that shortly. It's also completely understandable if this part of the process starts to feel really, really overwhelming. Particularly if you're also experiencing strong emotions related to having received the news of your diagnosis. This kind of news can bring about a range of feelings: shock, stress, anxiety, depression, numbness, feelings of urgency to really get things moving, and so many more. Regardless of what's going on with you emotionally, it's important for you to know that your feelings are valid and there's no right reaction. Allowing yourself to feel these emotions can be a really important part of preparing to make some of these decisions. But first things first, taking a beat can be helpful to get yourself centered and focused. Look at what you need to do next and give yourself the space to breathe and process. This can make those next steps feel just a little bit more manageable. So over the next few slides, we're going to really discuss what it looks like to gather information, to get organized in order to better understand what your options are, and to make an action plan for moving forward with treatments, surgeries, medical interventions, and then really how work might fit into these factors. I do want to quickly acknowledge, though, that sometimes decisions do need to be made rather quickly due to specific circumstances. So it may not always be possible to apply this exact process to every single decision you make. What we're trying to do here is to really offer you some tips and tools that may help with making decisions and planning just a little bit easier. So obviously everything is taken with a grain of salt. So moving on, this next step in the process is gathering information. And this can really help guide your decisions. So to simplify this process a bit, we break it down into types of information to gather into 3 categories, which are laid out on this slide. And you can see they're medical and treatment information, work information, and legal information. So over the next few slides, we'll take a deeper dive into each just to really understand what specifically falls into each of these 3 categories. So the place to start when it comes to gathering medical and treatment information is your medical team. You want to be asking questions about the timeline for surgery and any other treatment protocols like chemo or radiation, as well as whatever those potential side effects may be. Understanding this information can help you to start to figure out whether or not it will be possible for you to work during all or part of treatment. Also, it's important for you to be open with your healthcare team about the specifics about what your job entails day to day, including any concerns that you might have, as well as what your work-related goals are, so that they can really work with you on a plan to really balance work and cancer that works for what you want as well. So an example might be taking a proactive approach to make sure that your chemo treatments are scheduled in a way that lines up with your needs and commitments at work. This can really help you to feel like a more active participant in your care while also feeling in more control of your work responsibilities. So an example of this might look like your doctor says they would like to see you in 2 weeks, and the scheduler says that you can come in on a Thursday morning. But you know in the back of your head that you have set meetings with your team every Thursday morning that are really important for you to participate in. So it's worth asking if Wednesday or Friday would work instead. This may not always be possible, but remember, asking can't hurt and can relieve you of some of that internal pressure and stress, as well as some of those what ifs. So now we move into our conversation about gathering information regarding work itself. So this part of the process can help you to start thinking about how you can manage your treatment protocol with the way your company works and the duties of your job. So for instance, researching your workplace's existing policies and flexibilities can lend insight into how to devise a plan should you decide to continue working during all or part of treatment. And learning about your company's leave policies can also help you determine your ability to take time off in either larger or smaller chunks of time as you may need to. So a lot of this information that you're looking for is typically accessible through an online employee portal or in a handbook that you can locate and look through on your own without even having to speak with anyone, which can be kind of nice and a little less stressful. However, that being said, you may also prefer to have a conversation with a person or may find that you need to reach out to someone in order to get your hands on a copy of that handbook or in order to have your questions answered. Also, if you've been at a company for a while and have seen coworkers experiencing personal challenges, really try to think back to how they were handled, both the good and bad aspects, and consider how that might color your situation and experience. And if you have a close enough relationship with them, perhaps consider talking to them about how the company responded to them. This can be serious medical conditions, this could be personal family issues they had, or even just someone going out on maternity leave. How was it handled? How did the managers respond to the news? And what kind of accommodations were made in order to help that person continue doing their job? So as we discuss the process of gathering legal information, I do want to mention that since I mentioned I am a social worker and the law is not my area of training or licensure, if you do have specific questions about your situation, I absolutely encourage you to reach out to an attorney. But the law does play a very important role in thinking about and talking about work and cancer, which is why I include it. understandably, it can be scary to start thinking about the law and our jobs. So I want to stress that we're not going to be talking about this topic because we think it's likely that an employee situation may become litigious, but rather because legal and practical issues don't exist in separate vacuums. Often, when there's a practical concern, there is a legal piece to it as well. And for many people, the law becomes a key tool for helping them pull together a plan for working through treatment if they qualify for those protections. So again, if you're interested in learning more about which federal or state workplace laws and protections may or may not be available to you, I do encourage you to reach out to a legal expert. You can also find more broad, reliable information about laws on various government websites, as well as educational blogs and resources. At the end of the presentation, I'll be sharing some of those resources as well, so you have them on hand. But with all of that said, for the purposes of today's discussion, I do want to quickly discuss one key law in order just to really help provide a foundation for any additional fact-finding that may be necessary. So this law is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. To start, the ADA is a federal law, which means it applies in all 50 states. And the part that's relevant to work in cancer comes from Title I. And like all laws, it does have certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. So in really broad strokes, they are that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. You must have the necessary skills, certifications, qualifications to do the job. And your disability must meet the criteria as determined by the ADA. So if you do meet all of these requirements, the ADA can protect you from discrimination and may also provide access to reasonable accommodations, which I'm going to be discussing a little bit more later on. Again, this is really just a quick overview so that you know the ADA is something to consider, and I encourage you definitely to speak with a legal professional to determine if you're eligible to use the ADA's protections. Now, if right off the bat you're thinking, well, my employer doesn't have 15 employees, so this wouldn't apply to me, there are state fair employment laws that are in each state and sometimes even offer more extensive coverage and protection than the ADA, so it's worth looking into those as well. There are some resources at the bottom of this slide that you can check out and find out more information about the ADA. So once you've gathered all of this information, getting and staying organized is the next step. So in general, being organized makes life easier, and it really removes some of the chaos that we all naturally face in our lives. But after receiving a cancer diagnosis, staying organized can be extremely helpful and may even have a positive impact, both physically and emotionally. Staying organized can aid in the various decisions you may need to make, including the decision of whether or not to work. It can help you feel a sense of control during more overwhelming moments. This control can translate into empowerment and feeling much more confident about your situation. It can help to decrease work-related stress. Just knowing that you have all the information you need and you don't have to go scrambling for it can really ease some of those anxieties that are related. And of course, it allows you to be better prepared for any potential hiccups or issues that could arise along the way. So with all of that said, let's now break down some of those best practices for getting and staying organized in situations like this. So keeping all of your paperwork and documents in one place may seem like a simple thing to do, but it can make a really big difference. Whether you're a fan of digital files or prefer to print out hard copies that you can actually touch and highlight, just having a centralized storage spot can really reduce the headache of constantly searching for important details that might be necessary to make appointments or to communicate with your insurance company or any other needs you may have. It's also the case that during your initial information gathering, you may come across pieces of information that aren't really relevant today, but they could be useful down the line. So by making sure you have all of your information stored in the same place, it also means that you'll know where to look for it when the time comes. So even information like today, if you wanted to save today's slides down into a folder so that you have reference later on, that can be really helpful. Next, I really encourage you to take notes during your appointments. Again, you may prefer to use a notebook that you can write in, or your smartphone or tablet. Our Living and Working with Cancer workbook that we offer has a notes section in it that can help you to keep track of things and write everything down. Recordings might be an option as well, if that's okay with the person that you're speaking with. It's always a good idea to ask that. But the bottom line is really, these are all tools that can be used so that you don't have to rely solely on your memory, which during a stressful time like this can be really challenging. Also, if you feel comfortable, try to bring a friend or a family member to appointments. While you may rather attend appointments and treatments alone, which is entirely a personal decision, if you are open to having someone from your support network join you, you can act as another recording device, or they can act as another recording device, and perhaps catch things that you may have missed or forgotten in your conversations with your doctor. Because ultimately you are absorbing a ton of information during this. And again, when you are under a great deal of stress, it's hard to retain that information. And also, of course, most basically, having someone to keep you company can also help to keep your spirits up and to distract you from what's going on a little bit. Writing everything down so you have a record to refer back to is a really important practice. Whether these are questions, concerns, or observations to discuss during future medical appointments, keeping track of questions that might arise outside of appointment times, concerns regarding treatment or side effects, or even certain observations that you've made during or after treatment can really allow for a more involved process where, again, you're able to be an active participant in your treatment plan and care. And, so many times we do end up just accepting what people tell us, but if we're able to really identify some challenges we're having, questions that we have, concerns we have, it does force your provider to answer those and to converse with you in a way that involves your opinion and what you're seeing going on, as opposed to just them telling you what's happening. Also in these notebooks, it can be helpful to write down ideas and scripts for future workplace conversations. So this can include phone calls or project updates. It's really a place to keep track of those involved in your care or employment conversations. And also a place to jot down any tips that are given to you from others in the cancer community. Those of you who are very newly diagnosed will probably start to realize that others in the cancer community are always happy to give tips and tricks and things that worked for them, things to avoid. It's a really tight-knit and compassionate community. And so being able to write those things down and have them in your pocket for when you might need them can be really helpful. But really, taking away from this overall, taking the time to prepare and get organized on days that you have more energy can really, really pay off on those days that you find that you have less. And you don't have to scramble so much as you might have to otherwise. So then now that you've put in the work of identifying information and getting yourself organized, it is time to make a decision about whether or not to work. So to do this, review the information you've gathered and really think through how it might be applied in alternative scenarios. So talk through some of those pros and cons of your options with those who are close to you and who understand your circumstances. They can often provide different perspectives, which may highlight aspects that you may not have considered yourself or were a little too distracted or overwhelmed to consider. And also remember, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation where you're either working through all of treatment or not working at all. For plenty of survivors, strategically taking shorter periods of time off, whether that means 2 weeks to recover from surgery or a few days here and there for chemo appointments, is really what allows them to continue to stay actively engaged in their work. I do also want to mention that if you are looking for work when you receive a diagnosis, you can also think about what it would look like to get a job during this stage and what considerations would need to be taken into account in order to really make a decision around working or not. A lot of things you don't know until you start working at a place, but if there are things you can infer, things you can ask, people that you can talk to, get a sense of what it's like to work there, that can really help you to make that decision of whether you're going to be in a place where you can start a new job or not. Excuse me. Now let's talk about creating an actual plan for yourself. Now, as I've mentioned throughout, after receiving a cancer diagnosis and throughout treatment, people sometimes feel like a lot of things are suddenly just completely out of their control. But creating an action plan, to the extent that it is possible, can help you empower yourself and maybe even regain a sense of control over your circumstances. So here we've laid out the elements of a successful action plan. First, it addresses your unique needs and goals in terms of treatment, work, your personal and family life, and so on. It's also key that there's some sense of priority given to the various items on your action plan. But it's also important to remember that the treatment experience can be very fluid. It's possible and likely that things may change. So while the plan that you may outline today may seem airtight, it may have to be modified over time as things evolve, which inevitably they do. So it really is important to stay flexible and to communicate appropriately at work. Additionally, when we think about a successful action plan in the context of work, it also incorporates your employer's needs as well as your own. Now, I'm definitely not saying that your employer's needs should be put above yours or that there's no room to negotiate how work will get done. Again, we're going to be talking a little bit more about that shortly. It's just important to make sure that these get woven into your thinking as well, so that you have a realistic plan for yourself that doesn't have to be completely erased and gone back to the drawing board. Another critical component of an action plan is identifying the places where others might be able to pitch in. So for some, understandably, asking for help can be a real challenge, but when and where you feel comfortable doing so, asking for help can alleviate some of the stress and worries that may be weighing you down. So in a work context, this may mean sitting down with your manager or supervisor so that you can think through together how coworkers might be able to help and fill in where you're not able to. Finally, as we've already discussed, there's a benefit to having some things written down, and the same is true here. In fact, a practice that we often encourage is keeping what we call a work diary. And so this can be a useful tool in helping you to evolve your action plan based on your needs, to go back to notes, to think about how you've been feeling, etc. So some approaches to making a working cancer diary work for you include that it can help you to really map out an overview of what treatment's likely to look like in both the short and long term. So by collecting important treatment-related dates, such as for surgery or chemo, and the information that's available to you about potential recovery time, side effects, etc., you can then compare them to your work calendar and see where there might be any issues or conflicts in terms of scheduling. Of course, there may be certain appointments and treatments that are date specific, so you need to make sure that those take priority over work deadlines, of course. But as we discussed earlier, it can be worth talking with your healthcare team to see where there is flexibility in that scheduling as well. Your schedule, again, is a really great area where there's opportunity for you to become an active participant in your care. And this is really by advocating for your needs and, again, feeling more in control of the process. There are a few areas where you may be able to feel in control, and this is definitely one of them. Now, once you've started to lay out the broad overview of treatment as a whole, then you can start to really drill down into mapping out what each individual work week might look like. And then keep notes on your experience of how the weeks are actually playing out as they're going along. So tracking how you feel at certain times of the day. What side effects are you experiencing? If or how you were able to identify any ways to mitigate some of those symptoms. These can all really help to reveal important patterns, which you can then work with strategically. So for example, this might mean planning to eat at specific intervals throughout the workday to combat nausea. So let's say you were someone who never ate breakfast before, and now you find that if you don't eat something by 8:30 a.m., you are sick all morning. This is just something that you're going to have to learn as you go, but taking note of it can really help you to plan better. Or maybe create a schedule of breaks that are aligning with when you've noticed you're experiencing the strongest bouts of fatigue. So this way you can maximize those times of day you're best able to focus. Once you have a reliable log, you may also use it to begin brainstorming some job modifications that could address your needs. And in cases where you might want to formally request reasonable accommodations, you can use these notes to really plan out and drive conversations with your employer. Having as much information to back up what you're asking for can be really helpful, but also just knowing yourself and identifying where the challenges lie can really help you to come up with plans and accommodations that are going to really help you and will increase your productivity. So now, while we're on this topic of modifications at work, I do want to just quickly return to the ADA. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the potential benefits that's available through the ADA for those who qualify is access to reasonable accommodations. So I haven't quite talked about what they are. So I want to define them. They are modifications to your job, your schedule, or the environment that you work in that makes it possible for you to perform the essential duties of your job. So on this slide, you'll see a few resources that delve a little deeper into reasonable accommodations and really how to request them. But I do want to just talk a little bit more about how to identify some of these possible accommodations. And when we say essential duties of the job, that's really those tasks and responsibilities that are listed on a job description. You know, we all know that a job description is only a little bit of what we actually do on the day-to-day, but those that are listed on the job description are the essential duties. So they are the essential responsibilities. So just keeping that in mind. So there's a number of questions that you can ask yourself in order to help identify some of these potential accommodations. So some of these examples include, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? So this would ultimately mean that you work the same number of hours, but they're just distributed differently. So varying the start and end times of the workday to maximize the hours that you're feeling best can be a huge help. So let's say that you wrote down in that work diary that you've been diligently keeping that the afternoons are starting to feel really, really hard for you and you're not getting anything done. But when you wake up in the morning, you're feeling pretty good. So perhaps your 9 to 5 day can become a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. day so that you're really putting in the hours that you're working best early in the day so that you have the rest of the day off. Perhaps you can also take time out during the workday to go to appointments and make the time up by working later that day or later in the week. Again, this may not work for every kind of job, but it can be a great solution for people who do project-based work. Understandably, those who have to be customer facing, if they're working at a help desk or something that has specific hours, it might be a little bit more challenging, but it's worth considering in other fields. Another question can be, can you work from home part-time or full-time? So similar to changing working hours, this may not work for every type of job, in particular those who might need to be client-facing, but it is becoming more and more commonplace. The pandemic has changed the way we all work. The number of people who are working remotely has increased, I don't know how much, but a lot. And it's becoming much more acceptable to work from home. I think the last 2 years have also taught many companies that people are productive at home. So by being able to eliminate a draining commute, that can really increase the number of hours that you're able to work and work well. So it's something that's worth looking into. There might be already a policy about this in your employee handbook. And if there isn't a formal policy, perhaps one could be created because it really can help to reserve your energy to work. In the event that you need some breaks throughout the day, being able to take a nap on your own couch or in your own bed can make a big difference. Perhaps your job includes allocated break times. Perhaps it's possible for you to take more frequent or additional breaks. So for instance, let's say you have a schedule that entitles you to 2 breaks and a 45-minute lunch. But what you really need is a total of 4 breaks in your day. Those extra breaks could potentially be considered an accommodation in this case. Or perhaps it's about getting access to special equipment. One survivor that we spoke to mentioned that for her, the glare and text on screens is really challenging. And so she requested a large screen and text magnification as a reasonable accommodation. Other people might be experiencing bouts of neuropathy in their hands and they work on a computer. So speak to type software could be another thing that could really help them do their job. Another possibility might be to have certain tasks or projects removed from your job. So these might be tasks or projects that weren't part of those essential duties that you have to do. So let's say, for instance, you work at the front desk of an office, and one of the things that you're responsible for is changing the water cooler, but you just simply do not have the strength for that right now. That's a very easily transferred task to another coworker. Again, these are really just examples meant to help you start thinking about accommodations and to remove some of the myths around the concept. A lot of people believe that they are really expensive or unlikely to be approved, but the fact is that according to the Job Accommodation Network, most accommodations cost an employer $500 or less, and a lot of them cost nothing. So just try to be resourceful and really think about your environment and what might be causing the specific challenges that you're experiencing. And keep in mind, it's all fluid. What might make work easier today might be different tomorrow. This isn't a one-time only opportunity, and you are able to ask for more than one accommodation if necessary. So if you asked for, one extra break a day, and then over time you realize you need 2 shorter breaks throughout the day, that's something that you could come to your employer later on and ask for. I do also want to point out that the Job Accommodation Network is a really great resource. If you're having trouble thinking about what accommodation might be helpful for you, they even have a list broken down by some symptoms that you might be experiencing and what could help alleviate that. They also have letter templates. If you are not sure how to approach your employer, this can be really helpful. Just some extra tools that can make the process just a little bit easier and more manageable. So moving back to the concept of the work and cancer diary, many people also find them useful tools in thinking through optimal times for treatments. So looking back over your notes about prior treatments to identify any patterns that you might notice. Then use that information to schedule your appointments at times that would be conducive to your work schedule and your energy levels. So for example, if you feel exhausted 3 or 4 hours after treatments, then maybe consider scheduling 2 p.m. appointments so that you'll be off of work when that fatigue hits. Or maybe schedule sessions for Friday afternoons if your body needs a few days to recover from treatment. Again, this is one of those things that you really don't know until you know. So it can be something that you can figure out later on and ask for those accommodations later on, but it's worth just tracking and seeing was it a one-time thing or are you seeing this multiple occasions? Additionally, keeping a detailed written record of your day-to-day activities at work can prove beneficial on a number of levels. This may include a description of your projects, the associated tasks, and really what's been done, as well as a to-do list with next steps. Keeping notes in this way can help you stay organized and really effectively manage your time as you move throughout your day. It also creates a log of tasks that you accomplish that day or week or month, which can be really helpful if and when chemo brain or fatigue starts to impact your memory or your ability to focus. So if your boss asks you when you actually got that task done, you'll be able to look back in your notes and give them an actual date. Additionally, taking down your hours and assignments and tracking those could really prove valuable if perhaps a worst case scenario arises at work and you do start to suspect that there could be some discrimination taking place. Again, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we don't bring this up because we think it's likely to happen. And obviously, I hope very much that none of you on this call ever experienced that type of discrimination or challenges at work. But unfortunately, we do know that some people do run into problems in their workplaces and have very unsupportive employers. So in those instances, having a notebook where you've been keeping a detailed account of your time and accomplishments can just prove very valuable in those scenarios. And finally, as this last bullet point suggests, your work and cancer diary can be a really great place for you to draft and revise your disclosure plan, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit more. Now, whether or not to disclose at work or in other areas of your life is an incredibly personal decision, and it is one that requires a lot of thought. So we share this slide very often in most of our presentations because it really is such a nuanced decision. What's important to know and remember here is that you're not required or obligated to share your health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. A lot of individuals with cancer confuse omitting with lying, but it is personal information and it's not necessary to share any or all personal information with your employer. It can often come down to how you feel about sharing. We're all always going through something personal in our own lives, good and bad, and you don't necessarily need to share that information with your employer unless you need to. So additional considerations include why you want to share. Is it because you feel you want to, or is it because you know it's necessary in order to access some of those certain protections or benefits? Now, there's really no right answer. It's about what your specific needs and preferences are. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. So when I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, I like to say that you can always say more later, but you can never say less. So if there is a need for you to divulge more information down the road, you can and certainly should be prepared to do so, but just know that you don't have to offer it up right away. Seeing disclosure on a spectrum can often help you to make the decision of what, how much, and to whom you'll be sharing that information. Finally, what do you know so far? When you're considering disclosure, it's important to share what you know to be true and not necessarily the what ifs. I hear from so many people who call and are worried that they're going to need to take time off, or they're going to need more time for recovery after surgery or radiation, but they don't know for sure. And they're thinking that they're going to just tell their employer that they think they need all this time off, but at the end of the day, they might not. And then it puts them in an awkward position. So you really want to get accurate information from your healthcare provider around timelines and treatment protocols. And just know that you don't necessarily want to tell your employer things are definitive, because circumstances can always change. As we mentioned, treatment is very fluid. So if you do decide to disclose, let your employer know that what you're telling them today is what you know today, and this can change. And that if it does, you will communicate that to them, that they won't be kept in the dark. Really, by assuring your employer that the dialogue will be open can help ease some of their concerns around being kept in the loop and their ability to plan in the event that you might need to be out. So, but again, I really encourage people not to operate off of what ifs and just operate off of the information that you have from your healthcare provider. Now, disclosure on the online space can have ramifications in the workplace as well. So we do recommend developing a personal disclosure plan for your online presence as well. So it's a good idea to make clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to be sharing online and off. You also want to consider where you're going to share it in terms of specific websites or blogs. And really, as you're thinking through what's going to work best for you, it's a good idea just to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. So it may be the case that some of you have already disclosed at work and everyone is being really supportive. And I am so happy to hear that. And that's an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is, the internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond right now and really consider the possible long-term impact of what those disclosures might be. None of us can predict the future. So you may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your really supportive boss may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And frankly, there's no way to know how that new person is going to respond to the information that they find. So just keeping that in mind. Now, the next step after you've made those decisions is to communicate those decisions with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people that you've connected to online. Because there's unfortunately so many stories from people who have experienced accidental disclosure from a loved one online. They may have thought that they were doing the right thing, may have wanted to say, you know, keep so-and-so in your prayers, but at the end of the day, it's really important that your wishes are respected. So, of course, even if you have shared your preferences with your loved ones, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you have a sense of what's out there. And if you do, in fact, have to have further conversations with people or perhaps do a little damage control. Finally, it can be a really good idea to consider your relationship to the larger cancer community. So for example, if you volunteer with a cancer-related organization, there may be questions about the affiliation. So it's just a good idea to give careful thought to the language that you use when you're referencing your involvement, if you are in fact choosing not to share your own diagnosis. You know, saying things like cancer has a special place in my heart because of, you know, some personal experiences, and so I volunteer with X, Y, and Z. But you just want to really think about how you describe that involvement. Now, when it comes to disclosing at work, like all the rest of decisions around sharing this news, it's an incredibly personal one, and it requires a lot of thought. And like everything I'm talking about today, it's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. So as I mentioned earlier, and I want to reiterate, you are not required to provide information about your health or your health history to your employer, current or prospective, so when you're job searching either, nor can they ask. But there can be situations where you might have to share information that is required in order to access your rights under the law. So again, this does not mean sharing every last detail about your diagnosis or your prognosis. It just means that you might have to provide some support for why you're eligible to ask for whatever it is that you're asking for. So an example would be that it would be difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer or for discrimination under the ADA if they had technically no idea you had a condition to discriminate against. So as you're thinking through whether to share or not, it is important to consider all of the different angles. Again, there's some more resources on this page if you're curious. Now, when deciding whether or not to share information about your cancer diagnosis at work, there are two major things to consider overall. First is, how will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And then what legal benefits are there to sharing this information? So with any personal decisions, there's different reasons that people choose to disclose. Personal communication styles. Some people are sharers. They cannot imagine going through such a big life-changing event and not telling others. But other people feel very uncomfortable sharing this personal information and are much more private. So really, however you feel about sharing is totally valid and should be taken into account. You might also want to consider the individual culture of the workplace, as that can really play a role. Thinking about the various ways people communicate with each other at work may help you decide if, how, and how much you want to share your information at work. And as I mentioned earlier, you may want to think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. It can be really, really valuable to consider these experiences as you think about what you can expect out of your own experience should you decide to share your information. Now, when contemplating who to tell, that's going to really vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. It's also possible that you might find yourself having to have more than one disclosure conversation. So if that is the case, we do recommend starting with the person that is going to be the easiest to talk to. For many people, that's a direct supervisor because it's someone with whom they can have an ongoing conversation, and also someone who could potentially be an advocate for them with some of the higher ups. But it's also important to bear in mind that most managers are not trained to be managers. So this may be the first time that they're having this type of conversation, and they could feel in uncharted territory themselves. Unfortunately, this often puts the burden on the employee with cancer to really help teach their manager what happens next. To kind of ease some of this stress and burden on the patient, we've actually at Cancer and Careers come up with a manager's toolkit that we actually did create because survivors really were asking us for something concrete that they could just take with them into these conversations with the supervisor that really allowed them to outline what would be helpful for them and how they could be most supported. It really can be a tool that's really useful, and I know that managers do appreciate having that guidance as well. Now, for other people, supervisors are out of the question. Maybe they don't have a good relationship with them, so they might want to go to HR instead. Now, your HR department can be a font of information because they're the ones who understand that employee handbook that we talked about, and they may even have experience with others who have been in similar circumstances in the past. So really, the most important thing to disclose in any of these conversations is the idea that treatment is going to be fluid, as we've discussed, and really helping them understand that the things that you're sharing with them now are what you know today, but they may not apply next week, next month, or 6 months from now. So this is likely to be an ongoing conversation. Again, this can help your employer understand that you do intend to communicate with the most updated information that you can, and helps assure them that you're not trying to pull anything over on them, that you want them to be involved in this process as well. So part of the disclosure decision also includes figuring out how much to share and with whom, and can involve considering what you know about the possible side effects that you're likely to experience. So particularly if you're choosing not to disclose either at all or widely within the organization. And this is because the changes that bodies can go through during treatment, whether they're visible side effects like hair loss or skin changes, or some of the invisible ones such as cognitive changes or a decrease in overall energy levels, can unfortunately often disclose that information even if your words don't. So if you are someone who isn't planning to or has already decided not to disclose widely, it can just be a really good idea to have a sense of the types of changes you're likely to experience and whether those might be perceived by your coworkers in a way that invites more questions. And then from there, it's about knowing how to have prepared responses to any questions that might arise so you don't accidentally share any information that you would rather keep private. So for those of you who are currently working remotely, you'll still want to be mindful about your choices regarding disclosure and privacy. Be careful not to develop a false sense of security just because you're working in a more personal, private space. In some ways, you might actually need to be even more hyper aware. Every organization handles its cybersecurity and tracking of employee activity differently. And even if you think you have a good idea of your company culture, you may not know the full extent of your organization's oversight. So on the extreme end of the spectrum, some companies routinely use programs that can record your every keystroke or take screenshots of your computer desktop. A company's goal for using these isn't really to be malicious. It just might be focused on helping to measure and support productivity, but it's still important to be aware that working in the digital space provides more opportunity for companies to breach your privacy a little bit. So when it comes to your decisions around disclosure, keep the following in mind. When you're on camera, you want to think about if you've decided not to disclose your cancer diagnosis, just be mindful that there isn't anything in your background that shows more than you're comfortable sharing. So it's always a good idea, and we encourage people to use virtual backgrounds just to kind of eliminate the risk of that. Meeting recordings, many offices share login information for companies' video conferencing platforms. So make sure to safeguard any personal information by switching to your own account before having perhaps a private telehealth appointment. And even then, check that the program is not set to auto record. Many virtual conference programs are set to auto record either locally to your computer or in the cloud, which could be potentially stored in your company's account. Thinking about screen sharing, making sure that whatever tabs are open on your computer, because everybody always looks at other people's tabs when they're screen sharing, whether they mean to or not. Just being careful around that. Chat applications, especially when people are working remote, these are used very widely. And just know that if they are on the company computer, they can be checked by your employer. Thinking about personal accounts and files and passwords that you might save on your computer. If you are saving sensitive information, you might want to take that off of your computer, perhaps put it on a flash drive or onto a different, maybe a different laptop or a different piece of technology. And of course, internet use and activity is always something that we need to be mindful of with work and during work hours. A lot of companies have different ways of monitoring employees' activity and productivity. So it's easy for a company's network administrator to check in on your internet activity. So if you are looking up symptoms or researching doctors, that is something that could impact your disclosure. So the point really is to think ahead of time before you engage in certain work-related or personal activities online and really make informed choices, because that way any disclosure related to your diagnosis will be a result of your decision and something that you are in control of. So some additional considerations to avoid accidental disclosure when working remotely and or in the office is really thinking about shared spaces and what you're talking about in them. Look around to see who's in the room if you're going to be taking a phone call or having a conversation with a close work friend. If you and your colleague that you trust are the first people to arrive at a virtual meeting and are just chatting and they're asking you how you're feeling, that's something to keep in mind as well, because someone could pop in and you might not realize it and they might overhear your conversation. You might also want to be mindful if you start leaving early or arriving late frequently, or if you know that you're going to be taking an extended period of time off, that just might invite questions from coworkers about what's going on. So it's a good idea to think through and plan some of those responses in advance. And that brings us to our swivel. So there's always the chance that your diagnosis is brought up by someone in the office. So this is an instance where it really pays to be prepared for facing these situations head on. So cancer-related comments can be addressed using a verbal technique called the swivel. It's a verbal formula or pattern, and it's used in response to a cancer-related comment that might be made by a well-intended colleague. It involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation around to a topic that's more work-oriented. So an example might be that your coworker comes up to your desk and said, my uncle had cancer. You can respond by saying, "I'm really sorry to hear that. It must have been really hard. And hey, while I have you here, what did you think about the meeting we had yesterday?" Really being able to shift this conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can be empowering and indicate to your colleagues that you're still that whole vibrant person with a lot of professional contributions to make. And it really sets boundaries well. Now, before we end our conversation for today, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about incorporating time off into your action plan. We talked earlier about the fact that deciding whether or not to work during treatment doesn't need to be an all or nothing proposition, and people may decide to take time off from work for a variety of reasons. Sometimes doing so is a choice that's made to help preserve energy levels or create some life balance. Other times it's a necessity because you need to recover from surgery or need to spend time as an inpatient to receive particular types of treatments. So one thing that's important to consider when incorporating time off into your action plan is how long you anticipate being on leave, as this length of time can influence the approach taken. Disclosure is a consideration if you've decided to take time off as well. So perhaps you'd only like your direct supervisor and/or HR to know about your diagnosis. Others might want their coworkers to be aware of what's going on with them. Just really think about what you want to share and with whom as you prepare to take some time off. The Family and Medical Leave Act is a federal law providing job protection when taking time off. And that's worth looking into. So you're going to want to spend some time thinking about what your specific plan might look like before having a conversation with your supervisor. And again, this is a moment where using that information that you collected when you were getting yourself really organized and gathering all that information can help that conversation go a lot more smoothly and be more informative. So just a little bit about the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. It is another federal law that can provide protections when taking time off. So this slide provides a high-level overview of the FMLA, as well as some resources where you can go to for information. It is important to note this law does not automatically apply to everyone. The qualifications are listed on this slide, but if you are eligible, the FMLA can provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave that can be used all at once or in increments as short as a few hours at a time. It can also provide health insurance protection while you're out on leave. So it is a good idea to check your employee handbook or speak with your supervisor or HR to really find out whether FMLA is available to you, or if there are other leave policies that are available in your workplace that provide similar protections. So a few recommendations for planning a leave of absence, whether it's short-term or long-term, is to identify a point person, someone you trust who can be a centralized source of information about you, your health, your schedule. And this can also alleviate some of the pressure on you to have to constantly update everybody on how you're feeling. It can also be your go-to person to find out what's happening in the office. So in the same context, taking time off, and still planning on returning to their same job. So it's important to understand your employer's rules about working or volunteering while you're on leave. So some organizations do not like having their employees checking their emails when they're supposed to be on leave, et cetera. So just understanding what that looks like. If you are taking long-term leave, it can be a good idea to try to stay connected, which can be through LinkedIn, trade associations, conferences. This can help offset any gaps on a resume. You can try to stay active by volunteering or consulting, maybe engaging in activities, doing some upskilling training. If attending a course or going back to school formally isn't an option or appealing, there are so many courses online now that you can audit for free. And so that can be really helpful just to continue to stay informed and involved in your industry. So just to recap, you should feel empowered to make the decisions about work after cancer that align with what you want and need, what information you'll need, where to find it. This can all help you to make those informed decisions that are so important. Getting organized can not only help you to make decisions about work after a cancer diagnosis, but can help you to maintain that control over your life that seems to be fleeting in these moments. Action planning is focused on what your needs are and how realistically they can be addressed. And this kind of planning will help to make the process around your decisions much smoother. And finally, disclosure is a really important piece of the puzzle when making decisions around work after a diagnosis, and should really be given the consideration necessary for you to feel comfortable and to feel like you do have control over your own story and the information about you. So I just wanted to put up this slide. As I mentioned, these are some legal resources that can be helpful if you do have specific questions of a more legal nature. I do want to point out some of our upcoming events. We have a number of remaining webinars for the year. Our Setting Boundaries webinar next month is a really great one and is really helpful both in the professional and personal world. We do also have our national conference coming up on working cancer. It is virtual and registration is now open, and that is also free. And here is my contact information should any of you want to reach out after today. I know that we have hit the top of the hour. I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any right now. I know this was, we started a few minutes late, so we can stay on a few minutes longer for whoever is interested. So if there are any questions. Oh, okay, I see one that just popped up. This one is from Samantha. Samantha said, I was just diagnosed last week and I'm nervous to bring up all of this information with my manager. Do you have any tips on how to specifically start the conversation? So obviously this can be a huge challenge. It's really nerve-wracking to just get that started. So, you know, taking it from the top of this presentation, really thinking through the information that you have at hand, some of the conversations you've had with your healthcare provider can be really helpful in terms of identifying what's most important to share with them. So if you know that you're going to need to take time off, you know, maybe starting with that, giving them some specific dates that you know of offhand, but really just making clear your disclosure decisions before you start that conversation with your employer. So maybe just saying like, I want to keep this between you and I until I know more information or whatever your wishes are. We do have some more resources on our website in terms of kind of communicating a little bit better in these circumstances. It can be hard, but the more prepared you are, the easier it will be. So that's just something to keep in mind. The more preparation you have and you give, the more thought you give to it, it can be really helpful. Any other questions from anybody? Oh, okay. Here's one from Greg. I'm feeling overwhelmed by the amount of information that I'm supposed to process following my appointments. What suggestions do you have to help me to feel more in control? Well, as I mentioned, I do think that it can be really helpful if you have the ability to bring someone with you. This can be, I mean, I know that anytime anyone's receiving a lot of information, it can just be in one ear, out the other, not because it's not important, but just because it's a lot to take in. So having an extra set of ears there can be really helpful. They could also take the notes for you if you want to focus more on having that conversation. As I mentioned, if your doctor is okay with you recording the conversations, just in terms of things to expect, things like that, that can be really helpful. Or just even immediately after the appointment, perhaps you go right out into the waiting room and just write down everything from the appointment that you can remember so that you're not lost later on when you're driving home and thinking, oh, what did they say? I can't really remember. So the sooner that you can do it, the better. There's also just going to be times when you can't process all of the information. And so just taking things bit by bit, don't be afraid to call your healthcare provider. If you still have remaining questions or if you can't remember something, it's totally understandable in these kinds of stressful situations that things are maybe lost. And Patty Jo also mentioned that a patient advocate or navigator can help in those situations as well. So thank you for mentioning that. I do agree they might be able to sit in with you on those appointments or assist you with staying a little bit more organized and getting some of your important documents together. I see that there's another question from Carolyn. Can an employer decline to hire you based on having a cancer diagnosis? No, but yes, you can never really they would rarely outright say that they're not going to hire you because of that. So as with any type of job search, if you don't get a job, you'll rarely know the exact reason why. There might be ways that you might be able to infer that information, but again, as I mentioned, I do think that playing it close to the vest is a good idea in terms of job searching. And if you want to check out some of our resources and information regarding disclosure during the job search, that can really be helpful in terms of thinking about what information you should share and the timing of it. So some people do want to share about their cancer diagnosis during the interview process. So there's certain guidance that we provide for those people if they do really want to share that information, to make sure that they're doing it at a time that it could be not a negative consequence for them. And Joyce, we will email the slides for this presentation. All right, so it is a little bit past the hour, so I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I do really appreciate you all joining us for tonight. As I mentioned, Sissy will be putting the evaluation link into the chat, and we will also be sending an email tomorrow. But we really, really appreciate that you all joined us tonight, and we really appreciate any feedback and comments on how today went, any information that you'd like to hear more about. And again, my contact information is still up, so if you'd like to email me any questions that we weren't able to get to, we'd be happy to answer them. And again, I see that Sissy has put the evaluation and post-test into the chat, so if you feel like doing that tonight, that would be great. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we do hope to see you at some of our future events. Have a great night.